both covertly and overtly, to ignore this reporting. Any investigations that do get carried out are invariably just in name only. They're designed from the start to uncover nothing and to protect the people who are actually doing this stuff. So that's how dreadful gag orders, denotices, media blackouts can be. It stops really shockingly important information to get into the public. Because what would happen then? If you knew that your government was involved in these things, what would that do to the government? It would bring it down overnight. So that cannot be allowed to happen. In terms of the magic of human history, that also cannot be allowed to happen because it would bring down the government overnight. So they are protecting themselves. Not us. They're protecting themselves by hiding this information away.
They are above the law. That's what it means.
There is no law for them. It doesn't touch them at all. Definitely not.
Yeah, the law doesn't exist for them. But we'll bring this back up on the other side. Special guest Neil Kramer. The website thecleaver.blogspot.com. Back in moments. Welcome back to The Vantage Point. I'm your narrator and radio host Michael Vale. On my special guest Neil Kramer, the website thecleaver.blogspot.com. Neil, you said something on a radio show that really blew my mind, and that was that the whole idea of freedom and liberty is sort of playing with a part of the pieces of the game that they want us to play. And I had read a book by B.F. Skinner called Freedom and Dignity, and where he said that whether or not we give some sort of stimulus to the people, and where we restrict the freedom, they get upset about it. But if they feel that they have freedom, even though it may be an illusion, then they're quiet as church mouses.
Well, the whole idea of liberty and freedom, if you give freedom to somebody who is saturated in the mainstream culture and who really all they know what to do is watch TV and maybe play golf and go to a game and drink a few beers, what are they going to do with that freedom exactly? What are they going to do with it? So if you give them $1 million and say, okay, you don't need to go to work anymore, what are they going to do? Get a bigger TV? Go to more games? Going to get some new teeth sorted out for themselves? What are they going to do? So freedom becomes important when your consciousness develops. And up until that point, it's basically irrelevant to people. What is considered freedom today is the ability to shop where you want to shop, to go to whatever store, or to wear whatever colour trousers you want to wear. Most people consider that to be a sign of freedom. Real freedom is always freedom of consciousness, is freedom of your own self-sovereign being, your own autonomy, as a divine entity, I would say, on this planet. And if you don't like the word divine, just swap it with something else. But as a real, authentic human being, this really kind of points to something that I wanted to mention, because we talked about some dark stuff in the last segment. So let's focus on some of the solution-based thing here. One of the key patterns in my work is this, that there really is no one to blame for this other than ourselves. And a lot of people have a problem with that because they want to blame...
Tell me who's on the top of the pyramid, and then I can blame them for all my problems.
That's right.
And everything.
Yes. Depending on who you talk to, they say, it's the reptilian Anunnaki shape-shifting bloodline, it's the Zionists, it's the Americans, it's the Pakistanis, it's the Catholics, it's the Romanists, it's the Egyptian Nefertiti, Akhenaten bloodline, all this stuff, yeah, all this fascinating, interesting, weird stuff. My answer to that is none of that is to blame. What is to blame is us. Now, when you consider, and again, consider this, don't have to judge it or believe it or disbelieve it, just consider it, because we can all do that with no trouble. Consider the fact that if everything is one system, and at a fundamental level it is, everything flows into everything else, then there is actually no separation between anything. Now, if you just hold that concept, if we constantly perceive our own inauthenticity, and to continue to live lives that are unfulfilling and dull and grey and plastic and just spewed out by the media, when we continue to live like that and don't do anything about it, then our inauthenticity actually becomes what I would say is a disavowal of our own shadow. And this actually produces a very unusual thing. And this principle is absolutely crucial to understanding my philosophy, and this whole evolutionary shift away from control to freedom lies in this. We are the shadow. We are the shadow. all the darkness in the world is us. As I've said before, every sort of negative entity that we encounter is our fault, and we are accountable for it. So as matter flows from mind, and as consciousness becomes creation around us, we're not allowed to walk away from the challenges that we face on a very personal level in our daily life. We can't just let things disappear and float away, even though we may wish to. Every single challenge that we have, when we ignore it, it goes away for a time, then it comes back bigger and harder and more dense than last time, more destructive than last time. Eventually, on a collective level, this leads to an incredibly dysfunctional human consciousness at a group level. And what you actually get is negative entities, actual entities out there that represent this huge disownment of our own ignored shadow side. And until we face them, they get even more and more extreme, and they turn into these ridiculous dictators and these evil despots. So ignoring a negative energy pattern in yourself will eventually come back and bite you in the ass, basically. And not only that, but when billions of people do it on the planet, that negative pattern comes back as an actual real person or a real event or a real timeline. And each time it comes back, as I say, it gets harder and harder and tougher until eventually it becomes this sort of totally inescapable crisis. As I said in an essay, a single tiny ignored emotional negativity in your own self can result in catastrophic things. So to short circuit this whole kind of routine, any negativity that we find in our own life, the best advice, face it head on. Don't ignore it. Don't sedate it. And whether it comes from your intellect or your emotional self or your sexuality or your family life or your workplace, whatever, face it as soon as the negativity arises and trace it to the root. And eventually, all the kind of negativity in your own life starts to change colour and it starts to dissipate and evaporate a little bit. But we're taught that negative is bad, avoid, avoid, avoid. That is not what we do. We have to kind of face it as a warrior would face an enemy. And when we understand that that enemy is ourselves, then we can treat it in a very different way. So that is why consciousness is so critical to this whole process of enlightenment and understanding the crazy world that we live in, because that enemy is ourselves. In The Prisoner, in Patrick McGowan's 1967 brilliant series, the guy at the head of the whole thing in the final episode, and you might want to just turn your ears away if you've not watched it yet. Here we go, spoiler alert. The guy is himself. So number one on the island, in the village, in Patrick McGowan's Prisoner fictional narrative, is himself. And that is the evil architect of the whole thing, and it's himself. So we are our enemy. So we have to face it to dissolve it. And until we do that, it will keep propagating and manifesting as all these stupid, evil, destructive things in the world. But there isn't anything outside of ourselves. And when we begin to contemplate that fact, then the influence of those negative entities begins to deteriorate. And finally, it disintegrates altogether.
Very, very, very interesting. It seems that the complexity of our consciousness does sort of manifest things in different ways too as well, and that if we don't face our fears or face our problems, they manifest in other ways. It seems, let me see here, we do have a caller. It looks like Chris in Seattle. Welcome to the Vantage Point. Do you have a question for our guest?
Hello. Hey, yeah, I had a question for you. I've always kind of questioned everything as far as even when I was in grade school, and one of the history they taught us, and I always had questions about it. But one of the things they taught us was, like you were saying, evolution. How everybody was like Neanderthals, beating around with bones and sticks, and I just always had a hard time with that, and been kind of researching a lot into it, the different aspects and the counter theories, and as far as like genetic degeneration and de-evolution, if you could put some input onto that.
Yeah, that's a good point you raised there, Chris. When you start to look at this thing, you realize that what is offered up, that seemingly we all accepted as young men and women as Darwinian evolution, survival of the fittest, this slow movement from basic forms of life to complex forms of life, is actually a crock, basically. If you say that in the mainstream conversation, that means, by default, in the mainstream conversation, that then you are a creationist or you are religious. And so they set up this so-called false dichotomy to say you're either a Darwinian or you're a creationist. You're either a scientist or you're religious, and that's it. Neither of those two things are the case. What we see when we actually study the evidence on this, and when we look at the science and we look at the real historical record, is that the ascent of man happened many, many, many millions of years ago. Where his origin was probably the same as everyone else's. It was from the stars, from all the different aspects, different intelligences, different minerals and resources and radiation. Everything comes from the same source, essentially. And you can look at that from a religious context, or you can look at it from a scientific context. But when you consider that the story of man is tens, hundreds of millions of years long, then the question arises, of course, well, where is the evidence? The evidence isn't there because every few thousand years the Earth receives these cataclysmic events, which can be looked at in another way. Cataclysms is how we describe them now. But what it does is, it's kind of like a watershed filtering moment to say, anything that is absolutely reliant on matter, that is encased and enmeshed in matter, is going to get wiped.
Coming to a quick break. Be back in a bit.
When I think back on all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can...
It is definitely a timely bumper there, because I learned a lot of crap in high school that I had to get rid of and get out of my own head. Back to the last segment of the show, and Neil, I want to thank you really for your information and sort of shifting our own minds. And I hope our listeners got a lot from it. I got a lot from it, even myself. I want to thank you for that. But before we get into the I guess you could say the last subject of the day, are you working on any current projects? Any new projects?
Yeah, most of my time at the moment is split between completing a book project I'm working on, which is really sort of all the key philosophy and metaphysics and sacred work that I do. Getting it all into one place, putting it down with my particular distinctive kind of interpretation of these things. So that is consuming all my time, which is probably just about ready to go now. The other thing that I'm spending time on is me and a friend working on a video project, which started in September last year. So we've done a lot of filming in the UK and the States. That is really going to provide a media angle on a lot of the work that I do. So people who are not going to get to see some of the things that I talk about, particularly if I'm talking about sacred sites and stone circles and crop circles and, these incredible sort of megalithic structures. But also, like, we did some filming in the New York subway system, and we were looking at various phenomena, but it is all always backed up with real kind of hands-on philosophy as well. So I very much believe, despite all the abstract, grand theories that we sometimes juggle with on these kind of programs, it's always important to actually bring it in front of your own face so you can smell it, basically. So everything that I do is punctuated with this very, very practical, hands-on application, and that is really, really solidified in this book and this video project. So they're going to be available real soon.
Oh, awesome. Matter of fact, whenever you get those projects done in the future, I would love to get you back on the show again. It's been a pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah.
One thing you talked a lot about on your website is the movie Brazil, and I saw it again this weekend, and I see a lot of movies like THX 1138 where you're just drugging up everybody, but in Brazil, you have the bureaucracy, you have the police state, you have the vain, degenerated society. It's a full money.
It is, yeah, and the frightening thing about Terry Gilliam's film Brazil and George Orwell's book 1984 is that they both show a populace that is completely and totally controlled without any overt force and without any drugs. What they're controlling is the mind of those people. So everything that you see in Brazil, which was quite humorous and funny and a little bit disturbing kind of 20 years ago, now is very, very disquieting and very, very perturbing indeed, because it's all actually come to pass. So it just reminds me, when I look at those things, our work here as conscious beings, anyone who's awake, who's aware, who's looking at real information and thinking for themselves, there's a responsibility on your shoulders, and it's one that you should take with some sort of dignity and some sort of adventurous spirit, because it is people like that who act as the sort of broadcast stations for everyone else who's interested in this. And the key thing here is that not that we need to stand on our little box in the